when you're really scared, when you're freaking out, your brain only searches for solutions in really like logical puzzles. Like it goes in small circles, basically. If you look at somebody who's really stressed trying to problem solve, it's going to look a lot like OCD, right? Under the hood, right? Just going in circles, going in circles, going in circles, going in circles. So when you're going in circles, you can't figure out what do I do next. It's great to have a list of all the shit that's worked for you in the past that you can turn to in times of crisis, because your brain won't remember the solutions at that time.
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again. Breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Stephen Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio.
You had quite a debilitating illness and, only about 10% functional. You'd been bedbound for almost 3 years. How did flow states and getting into a flow state, how did that sort of help bring you back to life? I think you described it as.
Yeah, so it was a really radical experience. As you pointed out, I've been sick for about 3 years. I had Lyme disease, and the doctors had pulled me off drugs. There was nothing else anybody could do for me. And I was suicidal. I was going to kill myself because I was, I could literally work like 40 minutes a day, and the rest of the time I could lie on a couch and moan, right? And in the middle of the question of when was I going to do it, that sort of stuff, a friend of mine shows up at my house and demands that we go surfing. And it was, it was a ridiculous request. I couldn't walk across a room, forget about going surfing. And she wouldn't leave and wouldn't leave and wouldn't leave and kept badgering me. And after, 3-4 hours of this, I was like, whatever, who cares? I can kill myself tomorrow. Let's just go surfing. Anything to get her to shut up. And she took me out to the waves, and they literally had to walk me out to the break. I couldn't walk out there on my own. They gave me a board the size of a Cadillac, and a couple seconds later, a wave came, right? It was a tiny day, maybe a 2-foot little wave, but I spun the board around, paddled a couple times, and I popped up into a totally different dimension, right? A dimension I didn't even know existed. My senses were incredibly heightened. Time was passing strangely. I seemed to be passing in a freeze frame and a crawl. And the craziest part was I felt great. I mean, I felt better than normal. I felt amazing, right? The best I'd felt in years. And it felt so good. I caught a couple more waves that day and had these same quasi-mystical experiences along the way. And, went home and was totally disassembled, couldn't move for a couple of weeks. But when I could walk around again, I went back to the ocean and I did it again. Had the same kind of crazy quasi-mystical experience. And over the course of 6 to 8 months, when the only thing I was doing differently was surfing and having these strange altered state experiences, I got better. I went right from 10% functionality, as you said, up to about 80% functional. And so my first question was, what the hell's going on, right? On top of the fact that I was feeling better and surfing should not be a cure for chronic autoimmune conditions, I was having these quasi-mystical experiences in the waves, and I'm a science guy. I don't have quasi-mystical experiences ever, right? And I was sure the disease had gotten into my brain and was rotting my brain, and that's why I was having these experiences. So, I lit out a giant quest to figure out what the hell was going on with me. And first thing I discovered is that these strange states of consciousness that I was getting into had a name, right? We technically call them flow states, right? They're moments of optimal performance when we feel our best, when we perform our best, or kind of more familiarly, those states of total rapt attention and focused absorption, where you so concentrate on what you're doing on the task at hand, everything else just disappears. And performance, all aspects, mental and physical, go through the roof. I also discovered that there's a big neurobiological change in the body that happens as we move into these states. 2 things happen important for my story. First, the nervous system gets reset. So all the stress hormones get flushed out of the system as you move into flow, and it calms the nervous system down. Autoimmune condition is a nervous system going haywire. So calming my nervous system down, that was a big deal. The other thing is there's a bunch of neurochemicals that show up in flow. All of them boost the immune system. So the combination is what allowed me to get back to health. But what I quickly discovered, and the reason we're talking today, is kind of the same state of consciousness that got me from super subpar back to normal was helping normal people go all the way up to Superman.
Yeah, really interesting. Because one of the things you've been studying and looking at is because, like you said there, like an extreme case of where people in flow is for your book about being Superman. It's you were looking at extreme sports, so big wave surfers, like extreme BMXers, like free divers, because they have that choice of you've got to be in flow or they die, And so you were studying, like thinking, if you can work it out in that state, then you could apply this to business, you can apply this to society, you can apply this to like different facets of life, not just in the extreme sports arena. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the problems with flow research has always been it's a subjective state, right? The only way I know you're in flow is I ask you the question, are you in flow? And these are the characteristics, and are they showing up? And now psychologists we've got a well-validated flow questionnaire, right? It's 50 years of research. It's one of the kind of strongest questionnaires studies in psychology. That said, it's still subjective, right? And if you're looking for really objective stuff, it was tricky. But action adventure sport athletes, as you pointed out, the level of performance has risen so much in the past 25 years, probably because of flow. These folks have gotten really good at getting into the state. And if they're not in the state, right, they're going home in a body bag or they're going to the hospital, right? So it gave us a hard data set. We said, okay, these guys, gals are in flow. Let's figure out what they're doing to get there and work backwards. And we now know that flow has kind of 18 triggers. These are preconditions that lead to more flow. Action sports are packed with them, of course, obviously, but these triggers can show up anywhere, right? In all walks of life. We know flow is ubiquitous, so it shows up in anyone, anywhere, provided these certain initial conditions are met. And in fact, just to kind of drive that point home, at the Flow Genome Project, we have a diagnostic survey. If you go to our website, there's a free diagnostic survey. It says, hey, if you go in this direction, this is where you're likely to find the most flow in your life, right? And there's lots of categories, right? Including, high-risk action sportsmen, hard chargers. And, but it turns out over 8,000 people have taken the survey. So it's one of the largest studies ever done in optimal psych at this point. And 48% of them find flow doing knowledge work, right? Thinking and being creative and, doing radio shows or writing books or working at IBM or coding software, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it's associated with action adventure sport athletes, and they're really good at it, right? It shows up everywhere and is, critically important in all walks of life.
Two things. I mean, like you said, there's 17. There's lots of different things, but two that jumped out. There was this quote which was fantastic. It was talking about how to get into flow, and I think you said that uncertainty is our rocket ride into the now. I love that idea of and that was just one of the ways. And novelty is another one. Being like in new environments, new things. And so these are all sort of triggers just to get us into that sort of state. Is it?
Mm-hmm. That was all the stuff you're describing is mostly Robert Sapolsky's work at Stanford, but he's basically figured out what you're describing was what we call the rich environment trigger, right? Lots of novelty, lots of complexity, lots of unpredictability, and all these neurobiologically, all of them trigger the release of dopamine, right? Massive quantities of dopamine. Dopamine's a reward drug. It's also a focusing chemical, right? It does a lot of things for performance, drives attention, drives focus, drives flow. And as you pointed out, if you look at studies, the brain loves nothing more than maybe, right? If we are in a novel, uncertain situation where anything can happen, as long as we're not terrified, it's awesome. We love it.
One study which was it completely, I was not expecting it at all, but it was like traditional view is that, we're only using 10% of our brain. And so people were suddenly thinking, okay, whether it's ultimate performance or state flow, surely it's only logical that then we're using, our brain is firing on all cylinders. However, research now shows that actually we've got this completely wrong, and it's actually back to front, isn't it?
It is back to front. You're totally right. And it's funny because what you're talking about is called the 10% brain myth, right? And it was this William James made a comment that was sort of similar to it. He was actually accurate, but then Dale Carnegie, How to Influence Friends and Make Friends and Find Whatever. he misquoted it, right? And that's where it started. And, you know, Hollywood, there's a couple of movies that came out in the past couple of years that have this myth, right? But as you pointed out, totally backwards, right? When we're moving into flow, a lot of different things are going on. But one of the things that happens is instead of the brain, you know, firing on all cylinders, it's actually shutting down, it's deactivating. Huge chunks of the brain are turning off. The technical term is transient, meaning temporary. Hypofrontality, hypo, H-Y-P-O, is the opposite of hyper. It means to slow down or shut down or deactivate. And frontality is the prefrontal cortex, right? The part that's right back here that you most frequently associate with you. It's your higher cognitive functions, sense of morality, sense of will, etc., right? This part of the brain is turning off in flow, and the results are incredible, right? For example, there's a part of your brain known as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's in the prefrontal cortex, obviously, and it does a bunch of different stuff, but most importantly here, it governs your inner critic, right? Your inner Woody Allen, that nagging, always on defeatist voice in your head that doesn't shut up. I heard a stat yesterday on how many words we actually say to ourselves during the day, and it's a tremendous number. It was huge. It was an incredible thing. Anyways, this voice shuts off, right? We are liberated. We're free from ourselves, and we experience this, right, with nobody judging. We stop judging ourselves. It's liberation. It's freedom. Risk-taking goes up. Creativity goes way up, right? We're not second-guessing our good ideas, so we're having more of them. Drives a lot of stuff, and of course, it's incredibly pleasurable for us.
The God helmet. I can not ask you about this. The God helmet. What is the God helmet, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know? And it's basically you can give yourself near-death and out-of-body experiences. You can actually, you can create that experience. How is that possible?
Way back in the 50s, Wilder Penfield, who's kind of this pioneering neurosurgeon, discovered that if you stimulate the right temporal lobe, really strange things happen, right? You can have out-of-body experiences. You can have that whole life review that shows up in quote-unquote near-death experiences. You can have visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, feelings of oneness, and also a feeling of what they call a sense presence, like the feeling like there's an angel or a god or a demon or a devil in the room with you, right? All that stuff happens because of when we stimulate the right temporal lobe. And we sort of know, in some of these experiences, we sort of know why. We have an understanding of what's actually going on biologically and why it's producing these experiences. But building on that research, 10, 15 years ago, a neuroscientist named Michael Persinger built a helmet that directs kind of weak magnetic fields that pulse on and off towards the right temporal lobe. Thousands of people have worn the device, and something like 80% of them have a profoundly strange experience, right? Most of them experience this sense presence. Jesus has showed up like 20 times. You have out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Some people, nothing happens, right? There are some people who seem that are totally, can't experience this stuff at all. We also know that flow, even though parts of the brain are turning off, in really deep flow states, it also appears that the right temporal lobe is becoming really hyperactive. So these experiences, these so-called mystical experiences, also show up in flow. In fact, the action sports story, I was just writing about this morning, so it's in my head. Seth Morrison, the big mountain skier, the very first time he threw a double backflip off, it was somewhere between 100 and 150 foot cliff, huge cliff, just crazy, crazy trick. He flew like right out of his body and was like 50 feet away watching himself. And a double backflip is totally blind. You can't see where you're going. You can sort of see your landing, but you can't see yourself at all. And it was the first time in his life he actually got to watch himself throw the trick. So yeah, really strange things seem to happen when you stimulate the right temporal lobe. Persinger has built the God helmet. So now, you can go have that experience. And there's Todd Murphy, who's one of Persinger's students, built a commercial version. Shakti helmet, I think is what it's called. So there's a commercial version. It's not quite as robust as the God helmet, but there's a commercial version available. What this tells us, of course, is that kind of these experiences for decades, forever, for millennia, have been, the sole domain of like misfits, madmen, right? They were totally off limits. You couldn't control them. They were lightning in a bottle when they showed up, and they were really, really weird. Now, not only do we understand the science underneath them, they're accessible to anybody. So here in America, right, there's 80 million Americans who identify as spiritual but not religious, right? They want direct experiences of the numinous, Well, turns out direct experience of the numinous is now available for a trip to Radio Shack, right?
And that's scalable. That can be, you can have it actually through like a game. They were talking about on the Oculus Rift or something, actually in like putting this into the game, or maybe even like one day onto an iPhone app. Like, this is crazy, like spiritual experiences as an app.
It's a weird world we're living into.
Another one which was just like, what, like it completely blew my mind, is this idea of mind uploading, like being able to, like, you know, this is in your new book Tomorrowland, you're talking about like one of the future things is like uploading consciousness onto a computer. Like, how is that even possible? I mean, because that takes this whole idea, like you were talking about Descartes, like I think therefore I am, but now one day people are actually going to be able to think other people's thoughts or something along those lines.
Well, there's a lot of different ways people are playing with it, but what I was writing about was actually some work being done at British Telecom. They pioneered it. It was for a story for the New York Times about what's called the Soul Catcher Project, which is the idea, right, that we can upload ourselves and store ourselves on silicon. Their approach was, and it's a limited approach, right, but they figured, hey, if we can record all the data that our senses take in, right, couple it with a strong enough information processor, right, and a robust playback system, we think we're going to get some recording of consciousness, right? And it's one theory, it's one idea, but what's crazy about it is this. At the time, this was in 2000 when they started working on it, we already could record all the inputs of our senses, right? And we've only gotten better at that over the past 10 years. They were waiting for a robust information playback device, which is starting to be our computers today, right? We're getting fast enough for it. And the, robust information processor and the playback device, right? Oculus Rift would work. It's a robust VR system. So, you know, it sounds like a crazy idea. They've said, hey, by 2025, we think we could have a rudimentary version. Ray Kurzweil is also looking at this, thinks they're off by 25 years and it's going to be around 2050. I have no idea. But what I think is interesting is this, right? What you're talking about here, so in Tomorrowland, right, I'm looking at the transformation of science fiction into science fact, and I'm really looking at kind of the massively disruptive impact it's going to have on culture. And one example is religion, right? Religion, all of the religions, major religions, use the threat of the hereafter, right? What's going to happen next to shape behavior in this life. Well, we're coming into a place where the hereafter is actually the here and now, right? So what happens to theological morality in the face of technological immortality? That sounds like a crazy question, but it's something we're going to have to actually answer probably in this century.
That's mad. In your book Bold, like there was a whole section on the psychology and actually getting, you know, your mind ready for actually, you know, thinking on scale, thinking, you know, large. And one of them, this phrase which I loved, was this idea of moonshot thinking. Could you describe, like, just to our listeners, like what you mean by moonshot thinking?
Yeah, we actually borrowed the term from Astro Teller, who's the head of Google X. And I'll tell you the backstory was kind of when Larry Page brought in Astro. Google X is Google's skunkworks, right? It's their big think research arm, crazy project. Google Glass, their autonomous cars, all their most sci-fi technologies come out of there. And when Astro got hired to run this division, they were trying to figure out what exactly he was doing there. And he kept saying, well, is this a skunkworks? Is this an incubator? And Larry Page kept saying, no, that's fucking boring, man. Shut up, that's boring. No. And finally Astro said, well, are we taking moonshots? And Larry said, yeah, that's absolutely what we're doing. And so they define a moonshot as a 1,000-fold improvement over existing technology, like a 10x improvement. Right? Not how do you make this 10% better? How do you make it 1,000% better, right? They're talking about how do you replace vacuum tube with silicon, something like that, right? The interesting thing about it, and because we do go into the mindset of Bold, what does it take to take on these giant Herculean challenges? Obviously, flow plays a huge role in this, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. One of the things is this way of thinking, of taking on these huge challenges. And the reason, and this is not my deduction, this is Astro Teller's, though I've seen the same thing in my life. And my co-writer, Peter Diamandis, has seen the same thing in his. When you go after if you go out and say, hey, I'm going to make this, this pen, I'm going to make this pen 10% better, right? Well, I'm sort of in a smartness contest with everybody else in the world, right? Everybody else who's working on pens, they're all trying to make it 5%, 10% better, right? But if you try to make it 1,000% better, right, you're not in a contest with anyone. And a lot of times you're going to fail spectacularly. But sometimes it turns out it's a lot easier to take on the giant Herculean challenge because you have to throw out all your pre-existing assumptions, all the original technology, everything. You have to throw out and start from scratch. And it works. And the term moonshot comes from when John Kennedy wanted us to go to the moon in America. We didn't have any of the technology. We didn't know how to get there, right? All we knew is the Russians had gone into space. They were kicking our ass, and we had to do something. So, hell, let's go to the moon in 10 years, right? He said, we're going to do it in 10 years, and we had none of the technology. We didn't know how to do it at all. And in fact, when you look at who they hired for it, right? They didn't hire August engineers who were 60, 70 years old. They hired 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, people just graduated from college because they didn't have all these preconceived notions, right? Their brains were perfectly tuned to moonshots because they didn't have 40 years of experience saying, hey, this is not how you can do it, right? An expert is often somebody who tells you how something can't be done, right? And they weren't interested in that.
I love that. I love that idea because it's so obvious. I mean, if you're trying to change something by 5-10%, you can't help but use the framework which already exists. But if you're trying to change on such a crazy level, I love that. You just got to just throw all the rules out the window and just have a complete blank canvas.
Totally different, but cognitively, Peter Diamandis, right, who I wrote Bold with, his laws are in there. These are his aphorisms, his maxims that we live by. And both Peter and I are big fans of having these lists. This side note, big fans of these lists. Here's why. When you're gripped, right? When you're really scared, when you're freaking out, your brain only searches for solutions in really logical puzzles. It goes in small circles, basically. If you look at somebody who's really stressed trying to problem solve, it's going to look a lot like OCD, right? Under the hood, right? Just going in circles, going in circles, going in circles, going in circles. So when you're going in circles, you can't figure out what do I do next. It's great to have a list of all the shit that's worked for you in the past that you can turn to in times of crisis because your brain won't remember the solutions at that time, right? So it's a very useful hack. And I personally, and don't take anybody else's advice. Make your own list. Trust your own experience and your own history, right? That's the thing here. So Peter's got a list. You can borrow his, borrow some from mine, but really make your own. But one of the things on Peter's list is this idea that if you seem stuck, begin again at the next higher level. I often find that that can be the case. When I'm really stuck and I find myself focused on kind of niggling, annoying little problems, right? When my wife is irking me for no reason, and my business partner, right? When all that crap is going on, the problem is I've been too focused at this level, right? I need to radically lift my vision. So usually at that point, what I do is I take on some kind of Herculean, ridiculous challenge because it kicks my head out. I think you see the same thing in action and adventure sports on a different angle. They all, action and adventure sport athletes, and myself included, doesn't matter what you're dealing with in your kind of day-to-day challenges. When you go out and put your life on the line, for something, it really fixes your perspective right quick, right? Suddenly the niggling day-to-day stuff doesn't bother you at all.
You can see completely perspective, actually see it for what it is.
Yeah. So I think that, I think there's a lot of proof from a lot of different angles coming in to talk about kind of this mindset shift that Astor talks about with Moonshot Thinking.
Yeah, and one thing that was really fascinating in the book was that you were talking to, have interviews with sort of Richard Branson, with, Elon Musk, these guys, and suddenly hearing some of these things where, there was, just the type of thinking in order to get there, it's a completely different level. And so you just got to just raise your game, which was, it was fascinating hearing some of those things.
I think the cool news, I agree with you, right? But I think what makes this, this isn't the first time in history that massively successful people have given advice, right? But what sets us apart, I think, at this time, two things. One, first of all, we have the internet. We have so much connectivity that all this advice is coming together, and we're able to sift through and compare, right? And that's sort of what we did with the kind of the 4 guys you talked about. We looked at, I think, 200 hours of their speeches, besides doing long interviews with all of them, and we boiled it down to 8 core principles, right? We found 8 principles that overlap in all their thinking, that they all share. More importantly, because technology is accelerating so fast, because biotechnology is accelerating 5 times the speed of Moore's law, right? So every 4 months, it's doubling in power. That's just insane. The advances in biotechnology, same thing as driving flow research forward. We can look under the hood of these things, right? We can take their advice and say, okay, this is cool, this is interesting. Why does it work? And we now can peer deep enough in the brain that we're starting to get answers to those questions. So it's a confluence of stuff that's coming together that's giving us real advantage. If we want to step up our mental game, there's never been a better time for it. You can get farther faster today than ever before in history.
Amazing. And would you mind sharing the story of Stone Soup? Because I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. It was this it was in bold, but it was the idea of where it was talking about passion and actually with the soldiers. Because it was the first time I'd ever heard that story.
Yeah, it's an old folk tale, right? And it really impacted Peter's life. And the story is a bunch of hungry soldiers come into a village. They're looking for food, and the villagers see them coming, and they're like, "Oh crap! The soldiers are coming! Lock up the doors, hide your food. They'll take all our food." Right? So they get into town, and they go to the first door, and they knock, and do you have any food? And the villager says, "No, we have no food. Go away." Slams the door. Second door, same thing happens. Third time, finally, one of the soldiers looks at the others and says, "Never mind. Forget about it. We're going to make stone soup." And they go to the middle of town. They boil a big pot of water. And, the villagers are starting to get curious. What the hell's going on? They find these 3 big rocks, right? They put them in the middle, and they just boil them. And they talk it up. "Oh, the soup's going to be great. It's going to be great." And finally, one of the villagers gets tired of just watching these guys and says, "Hey, if you guys are making enough stew for everybody, can I help? Can I pitch in?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, you know what would make stone soup so much better? Some carrots. If you happen to have any carrots, that'd be awesome." Another villager, turns to him and says, "Oh yeah, I'm tired of watching too. Can I help?" And they're like, "Well, do you have any potatoes?" Right, and on it goes. And eventually, of course, everybody pitches in enough, and the soup gets made. And the idea here is passion is infectious. It's contagious, right? And if you want to go after a bold vision, you need passion. And you need it for a couple of reasons. This term is so misused and so mystified and so annoying to me. But when you dig under the hood of passion, when you get all the gunk out of the way and look at what you're looking at, passion is important for a couple of reasons. The first is flow states are all driven by focus, right? They happen when all our attention is focused in the here and now. Passion is a flow trigger because we pay more attention to the stuff that we believe in. Simple as that, right? So it's intrinsically motivating. The other thing is, obviously, passion is very infectious. When you have a big, bold vision and you're very passionate about it, other people are drawn to your vision, right? And, this is both, stone soup, but it's what Peter's seen with the X Prize, right? He's taking on grand challenges, poverty, education, space flight, all these kinds of things. He attracts huge followers, right? Enormous followers. We've seen the same thing at the Flow Genome Project, right? People are really rabid for the fact that we kind of want to open source ultimate human performance to humanity. It's a big vision. And, we've built the largest open source research project into ultimate human performance so anybody can play. And people want to share it. They get involved. So, yeah, it works in the fable, but it really works in real life, right?
I like that. Yeah, you got such a massive vision. Then it's exciting and it attracts people. Like in your Flow Genome project on your board, you've got all these awesome people like Jason Silver. You got all these amazing doctors, and it's if you got such an audacious, crazy vision, but it attracts. I think somewhere was a quote about something that acts as like a beacon, and it actually attracts all these amazing people. And so I think that's fascinating.
And I think that's always been the case, right? That's how innovation works, right? And obviously, it helps to have a vision that's kind of grounded in reality, right? I could say to you, okay, I've got this vision. We're going to go to Cygnus X1, by Tuesday, right? It's a huge vision, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, so you gotta have your feet on the ground, but your head. Yeah, okay, gotcha. And what are the rising billion, and what are some of the ways in which technology is helping them to live a more abundant life today?
So this is an idea that comes out of our book Abundance, which is about raising global standards of living, right? And the idea at the heart of abundance is that there are these four emerging forces right now that give us this opportunity, give us this possibility to kind of meet and exceed the basic needs of every man, woman, and child on the planet. One of them is the rising billion, the so-called, poorest of the poor, people living on $1 a day or $2 a day, right? What's happening right now is all these folks are coming online, right? If Google has their way, I mean, it's 3 or 4 billion people online right now, but if Google or Facebook or SpaceX have their way and we get ubiquitous internet, it's going to be 7 billion people by the end of the decade, right? The cool part about this is we've never had access to these people before. Certainly, we can sell them stuff, right? Absolutely, that's going to go on. In fact, there are a lot of people talking about the fact that we're going to start giving away tablets and cell phones and whatnot just to open up these markets, because it's the interface that unlocks, a huge market. And, Dean Kamen, the inventor Dean Kamen, pointed out, nobody thinks about these folks as a market, but 3 billion people, 4 billion people, all on $1 a day, $2 a day, right? If you're getting 10% of that for clean water, it's a huge market, right? It's a huge opportunity, which has led us to kind of this idea that the world's biggest problems may also be the world's biggest opportunities. But on the flip side, the cool stuff about the rising billion is this is not poverty the way we used to think about it, right? These people are massively connected. They've got Google, which gives them access to, the same level of information and communication technology as, presidents had 25 years ago. We've got, they're extremely better educated. We've got the Khan Academy, and take your pick, right? You can now essentially go kindergarten through grad school online for free. So this is a much better educated rising billion. We're seeing all kinds of inroads with healthcare that are distributing healthcare through technology. Same thing, so much healthier rising billion. But the cool thing is, what we're going to get out of these folks is contributions we cannot predict at all. And I want to tell you a story. This is my favorite contributions you can't predict story, and what the crowd makes possible. So protein folding, how a 2-dimensional amino acid folds into a 3-dimensional protein, is a big deal. Protein structure determines its function, right? So for drug discovery, for medical advances, all this stuff, protein folding is a big deal. Till a few years ago, it was a supercomputer problem, right? A very hard problem nobody could solve. And then a bunch of grad students at the University of Washington said, hey, the human brain is really good at pattern recognition, and protein folding is all about pattern recognition. So let's just see if people can do this. And they created a game called Fold It, right? They put it online very quickly, like hundreds of thousands of people signed up to play. So the first thing we saw is radical advances in medicine. And one example here is there's a monkey pox that produces AIDS. And research has been trying to figure out the structure of this protein for like 13 years. Nobody could do it. It's a black hole. In 10 days, a bunch of amateurs working on Fold It in their spare time for free cracked it, and it's now being used to make major medicines. So that's the cool news. Like, it works. Look, crowdsourcing works. Big surprise, right? Here's the cool part of the story. A couple of years ago, the researchers who created the game got curious. They were like, well, who's the best protein folder in the world, right? And they figured it was going to be a Caltech professor, an MIT grad student, or whatever. And then they looked, and it wasn't a Caltech professor or an MIT grad student. It was Suzanne, a middle-aged, lower-middle-class woman from Liverpool, who by day is an executive secretary in a rehab clinic. And at night, unbeknownst to her until this started, right, she's the world's best protein folder, right? So the crazy part about all this stuff is when we talk about unlocking hidden potential, what our technology allows us to do is tease out those things we're really good at, those things we're really passionate about, and that we're kind of custom built for, that we've never been able to tap into before. So when we talk about the rising billion as a force, right, some of it is the obvious stuff, the stuff you can see, the impact on the market, outsourcing jobs, et cetera, all that stuff we've seen, we know that. More importantly, as more and more people come online, we're going to get these emergent properties, stuff we've never expected, stuff we haven't seen coming, and it's going to come out of nowhere.
So it's exciting times.
Really exciting.
And then this phrase by a guy called Bruce Sterling, I loved it. Follow your weird. What does that phrase mean to you?
Well, Bruce Sterling is obviously, one of the great kind of cyberpunk science fiction thinkers, writers of our time. And I think follow your weird means, so let me back up for a second, because it's actually a slightly harder question than it seems. Because there's the obvious follow your weird. But remember, I talked a little bit ago about passion, right? It gets really mystified, right? And a lot of people know what I was 4 years old when I first started writing. I have wanted to be a writer my entire life, right? I was writing poetry at 4, so obviously it was in me. It was a natural fit. But a lot of people don't know what the hell they're passionate about, right? And worse, the examples they have of passion are what it looks like on the back end. We see how passionate Michael Jordan is about basketball, right? We get that. We see Beckham in soccer, right? We see what the end result looks like, but what does it look like on the front end? We don't get treated to that, so we think it's going to look the same on the front end as the back end, and it doesn't, right? And what I always tell people, if you want to figure out what you're passionate about, make a list of about 25 things you're really curious about, and this is where the follow your weird comes in, and be as specific as possible. Right? And I'll tell you a story. The first time I gave this exercise, it came out of a writing exercise. It came out as a way to look where your passion overlaps, right? As good ideas for exercises. So the very first time I gave this exercise anywhere, before I realized it was a passion exercise, when I still thought it was writing, I was in grad school and I was teaching. They had run out of teacher professorships or assistantships. And so I got stuck with teaching creative writing in the Detroit school system for high school kids, or in the Baltimore school system for high school kids. And so I go in and I give this assignment, and I'm like, okay, make a list of all the things you're really excited about and you're really curious about. Like, if you had a free weekend and money was no object, what would you spend it learning, right? That kind of stuff. And come back to me. And people came back to me, and of course, being teenagers, number one on everybody's list was sex. Sex is everywhere. It was the thing. And I said, well, that's fine, but that doesn't tell me anything. Sex is not follow your weird. I want to know that you want to dress up in squirrel suits and have, blah, 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 blah. Be as specific as possible. And then look for places where 3 or 4 or 5 of these curiosities overlap, because that's where the most energy is. That's what passion looks like on the front end. These are a bunch of things I was curious about, and they overlap here, so there's a ton of energy. So play there. And playing there is following your weird, right? Because where 4 or 5 of your passions intersect, that's uniquely you. Nobody else is going to share that overlap, right? So you've carved out a niche for yourself, what you're most passionate about, what you're most into, the follow your weird stuff, and it gives you an edge, gives you a way to move forward.
I'm definitely going to do that exercise. Now it's a couple of speed round questions that we finish up with. What does a fulfilled life mean to you?
Well, all right. You ever seen Confessions of a Dangerous Mind?
No.
George Clooney's movie, the Chuck Barris story, and it opens with the bleakest opening to any movie ever. And the quote it opens with, and it's George Clooney, or somebody standing naked in a hotel room with a maid vacuuming, and Reagan's being inaugurated on the television, and it's bleak, and you have this voiceover, and the voice says, when you're young, your potential is infinite. You could be anything, really. You might be Einstein. You might be DiMaggio. And then what you have been, what you might be gives way to what you have been. You weren't Einstein. You weren't anything. That's a bad moment. Heavy quote, right? Really heavy quote. So to me, a fulfilled life is not giving into that bad moment, right? I think most people when they're young, they really do want to change the world, right? And it gets beaten out of us. Life beats it out of us. There's no way around it. But what's different today and what's cool today, because of the advances we're making on the technological side and because of the advances we're making on the mental side, right? For the very first time in history, individuals can actually change the world, which is radical, right? 1,000 years ago, you wanted to impact the world, it was kings and pharaohs. 100 years ago, it was robber barons and industrialists. Today, it's all of us. So, I'm a big fan of go big, right? Go big or go home. It's, it's what we do in action sports, and I think it carries into everything. So I don't know what a fulfilled life is. I think that, differs for everybody. I know statistically, and what studies show is that the people with the most flow in their lives are the people who score the highest on overall well-being and life satisfaction. So certainly flow plays a huge component. But for me, why not try to change the world? The only thing we know for sure is we get one shot, right? We get one shot at this life. Spend it wisely.
And what is one thing all our listeners can do today that will have a massive positive effect on their lives?
I don't know if it's going to have a massive positive effect today, but take more risks. Practice taking risks. First of all, nothing that focuses attention and drives flow as much, but you need it for everything. Risk taking and, go directly at the stuff you're afraid of. Everything you want is on the other side of that.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.